To whom it may concern, I am writing this letter so there can be no misunderstanding regarding my decision not to complete the 2026 Canadian Census. My refusal is deliberate, it is informed, it is principled. It is not the result of ignorance, confusion, forgetfulness, paranoia, conspiracy theories, or a failure to understand the purpose of the census. I understand exactly why governments conduct censuses. I understand the arguments about healthcare planning, infrastructure, demographic analysis, transportation policy, economic forecasting, housing policy, electoral representation, and resource allocation. I understand that many people view participation as a civic duty and regard the census as one of the most mundane and uncontroversial obligations of citizenship. I understand that many people believe the information gathered helps governments make decisions that affect millions of people. I understand all of those arguments, and I am willing, for the sake of discussion, to grant every one of them. What I reject is the conclusion that is usually smuggled into the conversation without examination. The census is not actually the issue. Statistics are not the issue. Public planning is not the issue. The real issue is authority. The real issue is whether any institution acquires a moral claim to information about another human being merely because it believes that information would be useful. The real issue is whether usefulness creates entitlement. The real issue is whether the state's desire to know something about me automatically generates an obligation on my part to disclose it. Those are the questions that interest me, and after examining them carefully, I have concluded that the answer is no. One of the strangest assumptions of modern political life is the way government authority is treated as morally legitimate by default. People rarely ask where that legitimacy comes from. They rarely ask whether it exists. They rarely ask whether the state has established a moral right to demand compliance. Instead, they begin with the assumption that the state already possesses that right, and then demand that dissenters explain themselves. Notice how differently people react depending upon who is making the request. If a corporation demanded personal information from me and threatened consequences if I refused, many people would immediately question the legitimacy of that demand. If a university researcher demanded personal information from me and threatened consequences if I refused, most people would insist upon voluntary participation. If a stranger demanded personal information from me and threatened consequences if I refused, nobody would regard that behavior as acceptable. Yet when the institution making the demand happens to be the state, the burden of proof mysteriously reverses itself. Suddenly, the institution no longer has to justify the demand. Suddenly, the individual must justify the refusal. The authority becomes invisible. The demand becomes invisible. The coercion becomes invisible. Only the dissenter remains visible. That fact alone should concern anyone who values independent thought, because it reveals how thoroughly many people have internalized the assumption that government authority is self-justifying. The most common defense of the census is that it is useful. I agree. Useful things exist. Useful information exists. Useful information can improve decision-making. Useful information can improve planning. Useful information can help institutions achieve their goals more effectively. None of these claims are controversial. In fact, I am perfectly willing to grant them. Let us assume for a moment that every argument made in favor of the census is true. Let us assume the data improves healthcare planning. Let us assume the data improves transportation planning. Let us assume the data improves housing policy. The data improves resource allocation, improves electoral representation. Let us assume every practical benefit cited by advocates is entirely real. Even after granting all of that, the central question remains completely unanswered. Why does usefulness create entitlement? Why does usefulness generate authority? Why does usefulness override consent? Why does usefulness create an obligation? Again and again, I hear explanations of why the information is valuable. Rarely do I hear explanations of why that value creates a moral claim upon the people being measured. The gap remains. The assumption remains. The conclusion floats unsupported between premises that do not actually establish it. Throughout history, governments have always found reasons to gather more information, expand administrative reach, increase oversight, and extend authority into new areas of human life. The justification is almost always the same. Efficiency, security, planning, stability, public benefit, the common good. Sometimes those goals are genuine, sometimes they are not. But whether they are sincere is not actually the important question. The important question is whether noble goals eliminate the need for limits. Every expansion of authority in history arrived wrapped in practical language. Nobody announces that they seek more power simply because they enjoy possessing power. Nobody says they want greater administrative reach because they find control intrinsically satisfying. The language is always benevolent. The language is always managerial. The language is always framed as common sense. This is precisely why it succeeds. Human beings are far more vulnerable to authority when authority presents itself as helpful than when it presents itself as forceful. Yet a demand does not cease to be a demand merely because it is polite. A claim of authority does not cease to be a claim of authority merely because it is accompanied by good intentions. The census may be useful. It may even be extremely useful. That does not answer the question of whether the state possesses a moral right to compel participation. What ultimately separates my position from the mainstream view is a disagreement about the relationship between the individual and institutions. I do not believe I exist to be measured, categorized, tracked, counted, analyzed, and entered into databases simply because an institution finds such information useful. I reject the notion that my life automatically becomes administrative property the moment a government develops an interest in studying it. Increasingly, modern governance encourages people to think of themselves as demographic units. We become age brackets, income categories, population segments, housing statistics, education statistics, health statistics, labor statistics, consumer statistics. Every large institution simplifies reality because large institutions cannot function without simplification. Bureaucracies require categories. Bureaucracies require measurable units. Bureaucracies require abstractions. I understand why this occurs. What I reject is the assumption that administrative necessity somehow transforms these abstractions into moral or ethical truths. I am not fundamentally a demographic category. I am not fundamentally a statistical unit. I am not fundamentally a data source waiting to be harvested. I am not fundamentally an administrative object waiting to be managed. I am a person. The fact that institutions find it convenient to reduce people to information does not mean people should accept that reduction as ethically legitimate. One of the reasons this issue matters so much to me is because modern societies have become extraordinarily adept at disguising coercion as administration. Most people imagine coercion as something dramatic. They imagine police officers. They imagine prison cells. They imagine physical force. They imagine overt threats. Modern governments rarely operate that way because they no longer need to. The genius of bureaucracy is that it transforms power into something so ordinary that people stop recognizing it as power. The demand arrives as paperwork. The expectation arrives as a form. The pressure arrives as a notice. The enforcement mechanism arrives as a regulation. Everything appears routine. Everything appears harmless. Everything appears administrative. Yet beneath the administrative language lies the same basic proposition that has always defined coercion. Comply or consequences may follow. The consequences may be mild, they may be severe, they may never materialize at all, but their existence changes the nature of the interaction. A request backed by penalties is not purely a request. It is a demand. Whether that demand is justified remains open to debate, but we should at least be honest enough to acknowledge what it is. Perhaps the deepest reason for my refusal is that I do not believe power and legitimacy are the same thing. This may sound obvious, but modern political discourse often behaves as though the distinction barely exists. A law is passed. The law exists. The state possesses the ability to enforce it. Many people immediately conclude that compliance has therefore become a moral obligation, but this conclusion does not follow. Power and legitimacy are not identical concepts. They never have been. History should have permanently cured humanity of the habit of confusing them. Every unjust law in history was legal according to somebody. Every abuse of authority was authorized by somebody. Every violation of liberty occurred within systems that claimed legitimacy. The existence of authority proves only that authority exists. It does not prove that authority deserves obedience. The existence of a law proves only that someone possessed the power to create it. It does not prove that compliance is morally or ethically owed. Yet time and time again, people point to legality as though legality itself settles the ethical question. It does not. It never has. Some people will object that society cannot function if individuals are permitted to reject obligations they disagree with. Perhaps. But that argument proves far less than its advocates imagine. Every institution depends upon compliance. Every system depends upon cooperation. Every authority structure relies upon a sufficient number of people accepting its legitimacy. The fact that a system depends upon compliance does not establish that compliance is morally or ethically required. It merely demonstrates dependence. If everyone refused a particular demand, the demand would become difficult to enforce. That observation tells us something about practical realities. It tells us nothing about moral or ethical legitimacy. Again and again, defenders of authority attempt to move from descriptions of necessity to conclusions about obligation. Again and again, they treat institutional dependence as proof of moral entitlement. I remain unconvinced. Ultimately, my refusal of the census is not motivated by hostility towards census workers, statisticians, public servants, or anyone involved in administering the process. They are performing duties assigned to them. My disagreement is not personal. It is philosophical. The census simply happens to be the example that brought these questions into focus. If this were truly about a form, it would not be worth writing this letter. The form is incidental. The deeper issue is whether institutions possess authority over individuals by default. The deeper issue is whether usefulness creates entitlement. The deeper issue is whether consent remains meaningful when government interests are involved. The deeper issue is whether citizens are participants in society or merely resources to be managed by administrative systems. I have examined these questions carefully, and I have arrived at a conclusion that many people will undoubtedly reject. I do not believe any institution possesses a moral or ethical claim to information about my life merely because it believes that information would be useful. I do not believe usefulness creates entitlement. I do not believe power creates legitimacy. I do not believe legality settles moral or ethical questions. And I do not believe that a free individual loses the right to say no simply because the request comes from a government rather than a corporation, a neighbor, or a stranger. For those reasons, and those reasons alone, I refuse to complete the 2026 Canadian Census. Furthermore, I reject the claim that the institutions demanding this information represent me in any meaningful sense of the word. This is not because I dislike a particular politician. It is not because my preferred candidate lost an election. It is not because I am dissatisfied with a specific policy or political party. My objection is far more fundamental. Representation is supposed to mean that someone genuinely speaks on your behalf. It is supposed to mean that your interests, values, priorities, and concerns are reflected within the institutions claiming authority over you. Yet when I examine the political landscape, I find almost nothing that resembles my worldview. No major political party represents my philosophical beliefs. No major political party shares my ethical framework. No major political party advocates the positions I consider most important. No major political party questions the assumptions that I believe sit at the foundation of many of humanity's most serious problems. Nearly every political movement operating within modern democratic systems begins from premises I reject. They differ regarding tax rates, spending priorities, regulations, social programs, foreign policy, and countless other issues, but they almost all share the same underlying assumptions about growth, consumption, production, expansion, progress, population, and the role of the individual within society. They argue endlessly over who should steer the machine while rarely questioning the machine itself. From my perspective, nearly every major political institution accepts as self-evident propositions that I regard as deeply questionable. They celebrate population growth. I question it. They celebrate economic expansion. I question it. They celebrate increased production, increased consumption, increased development, increased labor participation, and increased human activity as though these things are inherently desirable. I do not. They view the creation of future generations primarily as a positive good. I do not. They view human civilization as a project that should continue expanding indefinitely. I do not. They frame success in terms of increasing prosperity, increasing opportunity, increasing productivity, increasing growth, and increasing participation in systems whose underlying moral assumptions I reject. How exactly am I represented by institutions that fundamentally disagree with me about the nature of the problem itself? How am I represented by people whose vision of success often consists of creating more of the very conditions I regard as harmful? How am I represented by leaders who celebrate outcomes that I frequently regard as tragic, short-sighted, or ethically indefensible? The answer I repeatedly receive is that representation does not require agreement. I am told that representation simply means that I live within a political jurisdiction and possess the opportunity to vote. Yet this definition stretches the concept so far that it becomes nearly meaningless. If representation merely means that someone exercises authority over me within a system that occasionally permits me to cast a ballot, then the word has lost most of its substance. Representation must mean more than geography. Representation must mean more than administrative inclusion. Representation must mean more than being counted inside a district, assigned to a riding, or listed within a constituency. Representation implies some meaningful alignment of values, interests, priorities, and objectives. It implies that the institutions acting in my name actually share at least some significant portion of the worldview they claim to represent. I do not see that alignment. I see institutions that govern me. I see institutions that regulate me. I see institutions that tax me. I see institutions that collect information about me. I see institutions that make decisions affecting my life. What I do not see are institutions that meaningfully advocate for the philosophical convictions that define my understanding of the world. This distinction matters because appeals to representation are frequently used to justify authority. I am told that because I live within a democratic society, government actions are somehow expressions of my own will. I am told that because elections occur periodically, the decisions of politicians become my decisions. I am told that because representatives have been selected through democratic procedures, their demands should be regarded as extensions of collective self-government rather than external authority. Yet this reasoning strikes me as one of the most successful political fictions ever created. It asks me to identify with institutions that routinely pursue goals I oppose, defend assumptions I reject, and promote values I do not share, and then it treats their authority as though it were simply an extension of my own consent. It transforms obedience into participation through a linguistic sleight of hand. It converts governance into representation merely by calling it representation. It asks me to regard decisions made by strangers as expressions of my own agency, despite the fact that those decisions are frequently made without my approval, against my objections, and in pursuit of outcomes I would never voluntarily support. A government may govern me. A government may regulate me. A government may tax me. A government may compel compliance. A government may possess enormous power over my life. None of these facts demonstrate that it represents me in any meaningful moral sense. They demonstrate only that it possesses authority and the means to enforce that authority. Power and representation are not the same thing. Authority and representation are not the same thing. Administration and representation are not the same thing. A government can exercise power over an individual without embodying that individual's values, expressing that individual's priorities, or speaking on that individual's behalf. To say otherwise is to confuse political reality with political mythology. For that reason, I find appeals to representation deeply unpersuasive. The fact that I happen to reside within a particular jurisdiction does not mean the institutions governing that jurisdiction embody my beliefs. The fact that someone claims to speak on my behalf does not mean they actually do. The fact that an institution describes itself as representative does not magically transform its demands into expressions of my own will. I am repeatedly told that these institutions represent me. Yet when I examine their values, goals, assumptions, priorities, and vision for the future, I see almost nothing that resembles my own. What I see instead are institutions that claim authority over me while simultaneously claiming to speak for me. I reject that conflation. The fact that an institution possesses power over an individual does not establish that it represents that individual. Until that distinction is acknowledged, I remain unconvinced that the people demanding my participation in the census are acting in my name at all. So that is why I refuse to complete the 2026 Canadian Census, not because I am confused, not because I'm afraid, not because I believe the census serves no purpose, and not because I fail to understand the arguments made in its defense. I refused because I believe the burden of justification rests upon those claiming authority, not upon those questioning it. I refused because I do not believe usefulness creates entitlement. I refused because I do not believe legality automatically creates legitimacy. I refused because I do not believe consent ceases to matter simply because the institution making the demand happens to be a government. Most importantly, I refused because I believe there must be limits to institutional authority. There must be some point at which an individual retains the right to say no. There must be some point at which a human being remains more than a demographic category, a statistical unit, a managed resource, or a data point to be collected and analyzed. If there is no such limit, then authority possesses no meaningful boundary. If there is no such limit, then every expansion of power can be justified by appeals to efficiency, planning, security, public benefit, or administrative necessity. If there is no such limit, then the only question that remains is how useful an institution believes your compliance would be. I reject that premise. The census was simply the example that forced me to confront these questions. The census is not the issue. The issue is whether institutions possess authority over individuals by default, or whether they must continuously justify the claims they make upon our lives. The issue is whether power should be presumed legitimate or whether legitimacy must be earned. The issue is whether a citizen is ultimately the owner of their own information, their own conscience, and their own participation, or whether those things belong to the state whenever the state decides it has a sufficiently useful reason to demand them. I have reached my conclusion. You may reach a different one, but at the very least I hope this has encouraged you to think more carefully about a question that most people never ask. What are the moral limits of institutional authority? And who gets to decide where those limits end? Thank you for listening.